Hi, you're with Julian on the Brown Note and a review of Beth Orton's album Weather Alive, which is, I'm ashamed to say, the first Beth Orton album I've actually listened to. I've known who Beth Orton is forever. She came to prominence in the 90s as a humanising female voice on music by the likes of William Orbit, Andrew Weatherall, the Chemical Brothers, and I certainly knew her through that. And I guess I always had her picked as a 7 out of 10 kind of. There was never an album that I really wanted to, break the seal and actually go in and listen to. Her first album came out in 1996, and she last released Kid Sticks in 2016, which is apparently a return to the more, this is great, folktronica. Do you remember folktronica? That was a thing once. Let's never mention that. But Weather Alive, reading the reviews of it really pulled me to want to listen to this album. Apparently it's incredibly different from her previous music, her 8th studio album, which I guess I pegged as polite and dallying in, electronic textures. A slightly cooler Dido, I guess I had it pegged as. This is, and no one's saying it, it's a post-rock album. It is not based so much around songs that you are going to sing as textures and moods. And it is, even listening to the opening track, the title track, Weather Alive, not many songs on here, but mostly over 5 minutes, approaching 7 minutes in a few cases, long form songs. The opener gives you a definite indication of where you're going here. It sort of twinkles in, and that is that this album is the logical successor, heir, to two of the greatest British albums of all time, Talk Talks, Spirit of Eden and Laughing Stock, which many people credit with being the formative post-rock albums. I have never been that big a fan of the Spiderland album, to be honest, but I still listen to Talk Talk, Spirit of Eden and Laughing Stock all the time. It's just got this really gentle sway, but she's made this a very raw album vocally. It's not polished at all. It's very, very like the lyrics are often very emotive, and the vocal performances themselves are quite untreated. Even and if they are treated, it's almost like they're run through a mangler to make them even more raw. It's a beautiful song, sets the tone perfectly, and she moves through these moods, but they're not as abstract as like classic ambient music. There's a bit more of the darker ambient music going on. The second song, Friday Night, has a really bleary euphoria to it. It's actually quite an upbeat song. It's got a very memorable hook in an album which doesn't really trade on, verse, chorus, and setting up hooks as much as it does on painting with colour. It's really, really beautiful, and it reminded me a bit of Phosphorescent, if you remember that guy, and some of the stuff that he's done. That's it feels low key, yet it's actually quite euphoric at times. It's got very scratchy vocals at times. I think she said she was quite embarrassed by other people hearing this side of her because it was a bit more vulnerable and a bit more raw. And that's not to say any of it's weak. She actually comes across quite strong here. Like fearless, actually, I thought. The only track I wouldn't say was near perfect was Fractals, the third track. It's got a more sort of standardized bass groove going on. It's a bit more up tempo, and the vocals here are a tiny bit weaker, and it's definitely my less favorite of the tracks. It's still good, but it's not as good as everything else. And everything else is a high. So everything else on the album is actually a high point. Haunted Satellite. She's a piano player, and her piano twinkles and has motifs that sustain these songs, not like, a full hook playing quite vibrantly, but there'll be twinkles that repeat themselves throughout these songs. And Haunted Soul, Satellite, another one, really, really great. Apparently she was listening to the sound of her piano reverberate around an empty house, which we'll get to in a second. Forever Young, like everything from Fractals on is just equally great, I think. Forever Young is again a lot like the Talk albums I was speaking of, and her vocal here, I think the vocals actually get stronger and more dynamic as the album progresses. I don't know if she recorded this chronologically. It's almost like she's easing into it. But yeah, it's one of the best use of her vocals, but particularly it's a better use of that sort of rolling bass groove. It's immediately more appealing than Fractals, I think. Lonely is another high. Apparently she recorded this album, and if there was an overriding factor, and it's a very post-COVID album in the sense of the loneliness in it, was her being a mother and living at home in Camden in London, and once her kid or kids had gone to school, how her piano really exacerbated the loneliness of the house. It became like this reverb echo chamber where you're padding around as a mother who's a stay-at-home mum. She's a long-standing recording artist, but actually being at home by yourself all day, something I can weirdly relate to, having worked at home for most of the last 2.5 years now, which I do love, but I understand if you have got kids and they're gone to school, how quiet a house might get, and that really comes through on a track like Lonely. Another great vocal, very expressive, lots of dark lyrics on it. Arms Around a Memory introduces backing vocals, which makes you sit up, but a lot of people say that the two Talk albums are the beginning of post-rock. I think that In a Silent Way by Miles Davis at the end of the 60s was the beginning of post-rock, and I actually sort of felt that in Arms Around a Memory, track 7. And the weirdest one is Unwritten, which ends it on a similar vibe to Friday Night. It's got quite this really appealing sort of uplifting, and even though it's gentle, it's got this like momentum to it. But I just got this real feeling of Won't Back Down by Tom Petty and the Heartbreakers. I don't know if anyone else will ever pick that, but I'd love to hear her do that live and interpolate those two songs together. It is really, really well put together. She's obviously got a team of simpatico musicians that are in the pocket with her. No one tries to take center stage at all. Everyone is here to provide added texture to what's going on. And it's the kind of album I imagine them sort of doing a lot of backwards and forwards until they got the tone right with her vocals and the instrumentation. Nothing overwhelms anything else. And I'm doing quite a few album reviews on the way up to having a 3-week break from doing anything, because I'll be overseas because I turned 50 and I'm going to Vegas. So I'm going to spam a lot, but I also had a little bit of a break before, and that meant that the albums I'm reviewing I've sat with for quite a while, and I have to say this has increased in its greatness over those weeks, and I definitely think that it's one of the albums of the year. So I'm going to give Beth Orton and Weather Alive a very strong 9 out of 10.